Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event series. Today, we have four distinguished guests from Austria, Bulgaria, Germany, and the United States. I will introduce them to you in a minute. Today, we are talking about the cost of war in Ukraine, nuclear threats, energy crisis, and protests and discontent in Russia, Europe, and indeed around the world. As you know, the war in Ukraine is still escalating along at least two fronts. In particular, there's the one in the south near Kherson, but there's also the front in the east in the Kharkiv area and beyond. And Ukraine is still making significant progress, it appears. At the same time, Putin is increasingly threatening us all with the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons and may use them. Much of the world is suffering from inflation and rising food and energy prices, and also energy shortages. Many countries are looking to US leadership to somehow resolve the crisis and the war. Turkey and some other countries have tried to mediate somewhat half-heartedly, while China and India, and also, for example, Saudi Arabia, profess to be neutral, but in a, however, rather pro-Russian way. The UK's erratic new government is in deep financial crisis of its own making and hugely distracted. And increasingly, there's pressure on the European Union, and in particular on Germany, the EU's richest country, to step up and assume more of a leadership role to end the war. Today, however, we heard from Berlin that Germany is still a teenager in global security affairs, which does not sound very reassuring at all. How can we deal with the turmoil and end the war without blowing up the world at the same time? Our four distinguished experts will help to assess the current situation. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thank you all for joining us today. Once again, we have a very international audience today. And I would like to point out our famous YouTube channel to you, on which the videos of all of our events can be watched again. The address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. Everyone watching us today is more than welcome to submit your questions to our four experts. Please send us your written questions with the help of the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our Krasno assistants Willow and Leila will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. Leila is actually joining us from Budapest in Hungary tonight. I'm very pleased to welcome our discussants today. There is Nadia, Dr. Nadia Boyadjieva. Nadia is Professor of International Law and International Relations at the Balkan Studies Institute at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences in Sofia, Bulgaria. She also is a visiting scholar at Harvard University, and she joins us today from Sofia. Then we have Dr. Jörg Echternkamp. Jörg is Research Director at the Center for Military History and Social Sciences of the German Army in Potsdam. He also is a professor of military history at the Martin Luther University in Halle-Wittenberg. Our next distinguished speaker is Dr. Stefan Karner. Stefan is professor of modern history at the University of Graz, and he used to be the director of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute on the Consequences of War in Graz. Stefan has told me that his Russian is much better than his knowledge of the English language, but I'm sure his English is just fine. Another guest from Austria, Dr. Peter Rugenthaler, the deputy director of the Institute on the Consequences of War in Graz, unfortunately had to cancel today for health reasons. And last but certainly not least, we have Professor Mark Kramer. Mark is the director of the Cold War Studies Project at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It is a great pleasure to welcome all of you today. It is wonderful that you all could make it. The way we will proceed is that instead of having lengthy presentations, I will ask each speaker a couple of questions, and I'm sure a lively discussion will follow. Let's start with Dr. Jörg Echternkamp. Jörg, you are a military historian in Potsdam, just outside Berlin, where the famous Potsdam Conference was held in 1945. Let me ask you, the Germans are totally appalled by this war and the nuclear danger this includes, but they're also suffering from ever-increasing energy prices and even the threat of blackouts during the winter. Are the Germans tempted to stop supporting the war effort and try to make peace with Putin? What do you think?
Well, thanks first of all for having me, and I'm really looking forward to our debate on the panel as well on the Q&A round that will follow. To give you a fresh idea of what is going on, let me pick up a headline of today's newspaper. The title says, or reads, "War and Consciousness." And the article is on a tank wreckage that will be put up next to the Russian embassy in Berlin for 2 weeks. Next to candles, flags, and pictures of ruins, the rusty tank will reinforce the memory of the war and try to incriminate Russia. But unlike in Poland or in the Baltic states, there are no candlelight vigils in front of the embassy. In February, hundreds of thousands of people marched through the streets of the capital and other major cities to protest the invasion. That is a long time ago. The war is still here, as you said, but the people are gone. Now, when Germans take to the street these days, they protest not against the war, but against the crisis management by the German government. Thousands complain in public about high prices at the gas station, for food and energy. In other words, the target of protest seems to shift from war to crisis. Let me mention only 3 fields of action and fields of protest. There is, of course, as you said, the economic field, the energy crisis. Germany is coping with an energy crisis after Russia cut gas supplies to Berlin in response to Western sanctions over the war in Ukraine. And now the government is struggling to help Germans to get through the cold. The plan that has just been presented includes a cap on natural gas and electricity prices. As you know, the German language is capable of putting or making new terms, new words by putting up different words. And the latest one that I have learned is called Gaspreisbremse. That is the brake on the price of gas. The second field, I would say, is the social field. Amid a soaring inflation, particularly for food and energy, the gap between rich and poor is widening. And protests show, I think, the fear to lose material prosperity, especially among people with lower income. And then there is another social question, another aspect that is the refugees from Ukraine that are still here and are still coming. While women and children from Ukraine are welcomed, the times of Chancellor Merkel's welcome culture, Willkommenskultur of 2015, are over for long, I would say. Now we have, on the whole, around 1 million refugees, plus an increasing number of asylum seekers, and that is leading us towards a situation that is comparable to 2015 in terms of numbers. And this puts a lot of pressure, especially on local authorities, housing, language classes, kindergarten, healthcare. These are the problems that we are dealing with and discussing in public right now. And money is not a solution because we need rooms, space, so that people do not have to spend their nights in gyms. And finally, the third field of action we could talk about is the political field. There is, in my eyes, a reinterpretation of this energy and economic crisis by right-wing populist politicians, not only in Germany, a reinterpretation as an identity crisis provoked by the German government. The way the crisis has been managed, so the argument goes, is an attack on German lifestyle, and that means especially on the middle class. The increase of prices, the dismissal of non-electric cars, the criticism of cheap flights, and so on. So all this against the backdrop of ongoing other crises, last sentence, that is, just to remind you, the increase of COVID and the likely return of restrictions in everyday life, such as wearing masks in public buildings again, not only in public transport, as has just been discussed today and yesterday. Secondly, the consequences of climate change. You know that this summer, Germany has suffered from flooding, from extreme temperatures and drought. Then there is the ongoing discussion on the energy transition as a sort of result of the climate crisis. That is the exit from nuclear and fossil fuel energy. And finally, and you alluded to this, I think, in your introductory remarks, there is a growing awareness of our critical infrastructure, or the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure, that is in need of repair. So just last Saturday, trains didn't run in northern Germany due to sabotage. So to sum it all up, I think the crux of the matter right now is that all these protests refer to the German government rather than to the Russians. And they ignore the fact that all those problems are inextricably linked to the Kremlin's war of aggression against Ukraine. So we are witnessing a creepy and I think highly alarming process of reinterpretation right now.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting what you say about the German social situation, or the domestic situation. What about the Zeitenwende, the famous Zeitenwende, which Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, proclaimed only a few days after the outbreak of the war? What does it actually mean, and is it actually meant seriously?
Well, Zeitenwende is definitely a term that marks a focal point in our public debates these days. It is a term of wide comprehension, much discussed, and there is no unambiguous translation, I would say, and take this as a sign of its complexity or vagueness, whatever.
How would you
I found, or I think the translation turning point in history or turn of an era seems to be most convincing in my eyes. I found other translations such as U-turn, for instance, which I think are misleading. But the term may be vague. The distinct origin of its use in the context of war is clear. You mentioned it. Only a few days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February the 27th, Chancellor Olaf Scholz has announced a radical change of German foreign and security policy. And to underline the historical character of this change, he spoke of a Zeitenwende, a turning point in history. First of all, Scholz took sides, which I think at that time was not as self-evident as it is now. On February 24th, he said Russia had launched a cold-blooded war of aggression that was, quote, inhumane and contrary to international law, and that marked, again, a turning point in the history of our continent. And the rationale behind this is, of course, that the invasion of Ukraine was seen as an attack on Europe's longstanding security infrastructure, a threat basically to our entire post-war order. So Scholz announced his decision to supply weapons to Kiev, to support a wide range of sanctions, and against Russia, and to boost national defense spending. So this was definitely an emotional parliamentary session with Ukrainian flags waving in front of the Reichstag. And I'm sure that future historians will consider this day a pivotal moment in German post-war history. Now, to return to your question, why is that? And what does Zeitenwende mean more precisely? And in fact, the various measures taken or announced indicate a remarkable shift, not only in defense policy, but also in economic and energy policy. And to be more precise, I would like to point out three aspects. First of all, of course, the arms deliveries to a war zone. Germany, as you know, has provided anti-tank weapons, surface-to-air missiles, and so on. It has very early on allowed Estonia and the Netherlands to receive or get the permission from the German government to transfer German-made weapons to Ukraine. Secondly, more money for the German armed forces, the Bundeswehr. Scholz said that the German government would allocate 100 billion euros extra for the armed forces in this year's budget. And in addition, he announced that more than 2% of our gross domestic product will be invested in our defense. And what I found also very remarkable is that the decision was supported by 2/3 of the parliament members, which I think emphasizes the thrust of this turn in defense policy. And then there were the sanctions, the exclusion of Russian banks from the international Western payment system, and the suspension of Nord Stream 2 pipeline. In addition to all this, there has been an amazing effort by all kinds of authorities, associations, social groups, and individuals to make sure that the people fleeing the conflict in Ukraine will be accepted in a humane way, with a fresh memory of the so-called refugee crisis in 2015. This, I think, which I just tried to sketch, is the future-oriented side of the Zeitenwende. However, the term refers to a moment of transition between the past and the future. It points in two directions, so to speak. And my argument would be that to fully understand the shift of paradigm and to assess the current policy, we have to grasp the historical dimension of Zeitenwende as well. In other words, what are we turning away from? And again, I would make 3 points referring to my future-oriented points, the measures, so to speak. Since its foundation in 1949, West Germany has refused to export any arms to war zones or allow third countries to send German-made arms to these areas. And this policy, of course, is deeply rooted in Germany's history as an aggressor of World War II. Second, for many social democrats and members of the Green Party, it has been particularly difficult to turn away from a purely defensive foreign and security policy. The Social Democrats, after all, had supported the Ostpolitik and the Détente policy under the then Chancellor Willy Brandt. And the peace movement.
Can I just interrupt you? I mean,
yeah, sure.
It's difficult, but you know, when we look at what is happening in Ukraine, much of the rest of the world doesn't understand these historical hesitations and difficulties, which can be surely historically explained, but we are in an emergency situation. Shouldn't the Germans step up rather than being too concerned about their past history?
Well, what they should be is different from trying to explain at least the initial hesitations that we have seen. And I think they have changed a lot. And the public attitudes, despite the protests with different targets due to energy crisis and so on that I have tried to explain, despite these protests, there is or has been a growing awareness of the emergency and the urgentness of this situation. But in order to, I think, understand the early hesitations and maybe why some people still hesitate or are not at the forefront of those who promote arms deliveries, I think you have to look at history and understand where the politicians, where the people, and where our history comes from.
I wonder what the Ukrainian people say about that.
That's and maybe if I just to finish at my last point, Zeitenwende is not only a paradigm shift when it comes to arms delivery or the involvement with and the employment of military violence. It has also turned Germany's Russia policy on its head. I think this is also a part of the Zeitenwende that you have to understand. Germany has a history as a partner of Russia. And my point here is not the special relationship of the former socialist satellite, East Germany, but rather I would argue that for decades, West German politicians had stuck to the principle of change through trade, Wandel durch Handel, and that used to be the mantra of German businessmen and politicians to legitimize their business with authoritarian states, hoping that this will incur political and social change. But the bottom line now is no change through trades. German cars in Moscow did not prevent the Kremlin from an aggressive war. So in short, if we take the historical dimension of Zeitenwende into consideration, I think we better understand what is going on right now, a shift of paradigm and some hesitations, but I think a lasting awareness of a completely new situation and the urgency given by the war.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very enlightening, and I'm sure we will come back to that and ask you some more probing questions. Let's turn to Nadia Boyadjieva. We had a few technical difficulties, but I'm sure to see, and I'm glad to see that Nadia has managed to join us. Nadia, you are from Bulgaria. You are professor at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences in Sofia. You join us from Sofia today. How do people in Bulgaria view Russia? After all, Russia is just round the corner from Bulgaria. How do they view the war? When I traveled to Bulgaria last July, I came across a large number of people in Bulgaria with very strong pro-Russian sympathies who actually approved of Putin's war. What is the situation right now? How does that complicate the situation of a united Western front toward Russia?
Good evening from Sofia. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for your kind invitation to join your prestigious Krasno series. It's a pleasure for me to be with you and with all our colleagues. When it comes to Bulgaria, first of all, we have to pay attention, of course, to the history and historical curiosity of Bulgarian and Russian relations. Of course, I'm not going to go through history, but I would say a few words about those relations, focusing on the very fact that for historical and practical reasons, Bulgaria maintained close friendly relations with Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And as you, Klaus, mentioned, passing through Bulgaria, you can see a lot of monuments devoted to history. For example, a giant statue of Russian Tsar Alexander II, known as the Tsar Liberator in Bulgaria, has towered over central Sofia for more than a century. And let me go back to the 2022. Until strict sanctions were imposed against Russia after the start of 2022, special military operation, as Russian officials called the invasion, and I will refer to this military operation simply as invasion, Bulgaria relied on Russia for nearly all of its energy imports. Tourism and commerce between the two countries were brisk, and many Russians were eager to buy property on Bulgaria's Black Sea coast. Favorable attitudes towards Russia were evident among Bulgarians. In many local polls and international surveys, the Russian government supported the formation and activities of pro-Russian and non-governmental organizations, for example, and friendship societies in Bulgaria. Compared to other NATO and European Union countries, Bulgaria was notable for its warm sentiments toward Russia. So what is the situation now? Of course, I cannot say much in this short introduction, but yet even before Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, questions had begun to arise about the durability of Bulgaria's friendship with Russia, as evidence emerged that Russian intelligence services, for example, were using Bulgaria as a hub for extensive spying networks. And if I go back a few years ago, in September 2019, for example, a former member of the Bulgarian parliament who led the so-called Russophilist national movement, one of the pro-Kremlin groups in Bulgaria, sponsored by Moscow, was arrested on charges of espionage and money laundering for Russian so-called patriotic organizations. And so we have a few cases that followed up afterwards, and a bigger scandal in March 2021, when the Bulgarian Internal Affairs military arrested 6 people, including 5 officials in the Bulgarian Ministry of Defense and Bulgarian Armed Forces, on charges of spying for the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service and to the Russian military's main intelligence directorate. So in June 2022, the Bulgarian government continued its operation of expelling Russian diplomats. So it expelled 70 Russian diplomats for engaging in espionage and for, as it was, I'm quoting, working against Bulgarian meaning and interests. So news about repeated disclosures of Russia's activities in Bulgaria has been compounded by suspicions that Russian officials are interfering in Bulgarian political system at a time of vulnerability. So we had elections a few weeks ago, even 10 days ago. The elections were held in Bulgaria on the 2nd of October, 2022, and was the fourth parliamentary election the country has held in the past 18 months. So in the during those almost 2 years we had four governments, I think. So we believe that now, and I'm not sure if even now we'll have a long-lasting government that could emerge from the latest vote. So, in other words, the lack of a stable government in Bulgaria has given greater leeway to the country's president and other Rumen Radev, who has long been sympathetic to Moscow. And we'll see what will happen soon with the new government. I doubt things will change gradually. And in my maybe comments later on, I will speak a little bit more about the economic situation, which is
just let me ask you, Bulgaria is following the sanctions on Russia.
Right.
Has that been proven difficult? Does the population understand that? And secondly, also, what about weapons deliveries and ammunition deliveries to Ukraine? Is that happening?
So should I answer immediately now?
Yes, please.
Well, so on the first question, yes, the Bulgarian government condemned the invasion and agreed to comply with the European Union sanctions against Russia, including in the energy sector. Despite the efforts by the pro-Russian non-governmental organizations and also activists in Bulgaria to defend the war, I think that the vast majority of public and elite sentiment overall has been strongly against it and supportive of Ukraine. So most Bulgarian expert journalists and politicians have backed NATO's effort to help Ukraine defeat the Russian army. When it comes to the second question that you raised, let me, to have the right not to go through this very sensitive issue. There have been a lot of manipulations, including during the pre-election period when political parties were arguing that there is there's a big issue when it comes to exporting for the weapons for the war. I don't have myself, I did follow the discussions, but myself, I cannot prove, yes or no. I think rather no, because of the very fact that we agreed, to Bulgarian government condemn the invasion and agreed to comply with all EU sanctions against Russia. But it was a huge discussion within the society on that very topic, and for a few months.
Thank you. Has Ukraine actually asked Bulgaria for weapons and ammunition? Do we know that?
Yeah, it did ask several times, but we did refuse.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure we will talk further about that in a minute or so. But let me turn to our Austrian colleague, Stefan Karner. Stefan, you are a Russian expert. You have deep knowledge and information about Russia. So let me ask you, what is going on in Russia? We hear about some protests, a lot of discontent. We hear about people fleeing the country, going to Georgia, to Kazakhstan, and to many other countries. So is Putin about to be toppled? We also hear about voices from the opposition and, of course, from his loyalists who are critical of Putin's regime and the military performance. So does that mean a turning point, a Zeitenwende is upon us in Russia, or is that maybe too optimistic? Stefan, I don't think we hear you. You seem to be muted.
Now?
Yes, now
Okay.
we can hear you.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. First of all, many thanks for your invitation to your conference. Secondly, you had a contribution to Austria as we started with Mozart's small night music. It's a contribution to Austria. I feel it so. And but I have the question: do we have night over Europe? Do we have night over Russia? Do we have night over Ukraine now? In Austria, we have a very similar situation as it told Jörg for Germany. A very similar situation is also in Austria. But let me start with more with a global impact of the war in Ukraine and in Russia. Look, Vladimir Putin's invasion also from Russia guaranteed territory of Ukraine in 2014 and this year, both, has had far-reaching geopolitical consequences. And let me say the main losers of this conflict are already clear. This is Ukraine, this is Russia itself, but above all, it is also Europe at all. This year, on February 24, Russia started the so-called special operation under the pretext threat from NATO. The NATO, I want to say, the NATO went since 30 years, step by step, to the border of Russia. For Russia, it was a red line. Secondly, help for the Russian population in the annexed Donbas territories. And the third was stop the fascism in Ukraine. And these mantras, I would say mantras, the Russian mantras, turned into a struggle against Western values, against Russia opening to the West, which was also directed against Russian culture in the broadest sense. The consequences of the war are dramatic: refugees, deaf soldiers, civilians, billions euros in damage, and so forth. Some ad hoc humanitarian agreements were reached because they served both sides. Calls for an end of fighting are growing louder, but without any compromise on both sides. Extreme changes are already foreseeable for the entire world, for there will probably be a diplomatic solution only after a decision on the battlefield. A compromise is currently not in sight because neither side is clearly outgunned conventionally. The war aims do not seem to have been achieved, and no system change is foreseeable in Russia. A major question at present is whether to continue to keep Ukraine warlike and viable. This is what the moral imperative demands as long as Ukraine is fighting a just defensive war. It is correct when it's often said that Putin has caused himself three problems by his war, namely a relatively strong unity of the EU, secondly, the NATO expansion in the north, and third, a turning away from pacifism in Germany. Maybe Zeitenwende. Yes, the findings are correct, but the answers are too short. Extreme changes for the whole world are coming. some main goals of consequences. We know all that. Global GDP is weakened significantly. The willingness to finance climate protection in developing countries will decline. The shrunken global economy, climate, and energy crisis will lead to global social crisis. Maybe, I hope not, but it could be. Mass unemployment and hunger in developing countries, and so forth. At all, as altogether, Europe's position in the world, including Russia and Ukraine, is going down militarily and economically. I will say it clearer. We, all Europeans, will become poorer and more insignificant in the world. Or I can say a 9/11 for Europe. The ambiguity of the moral index finger divides European societies. We, as Jörg told also, we can see it in the rise of right-wing movements, for instance, in Italy, in Germany, France, and also in Austria. Although Western values are being trampled underfoot in China, Turkey, and the Islamic world, these countries remain economic partners of the West. And at least with this war and the weakness of Russia and the West, Communist China will expand its position as economic number one in the world. The war is devastating Ukraine's economy, it's clear, but Russia too will be severely affected by the war, even if at the moment revenues are still flowing thanks to the price of oil and gas and record oil sales are being made. The ruble has made a remarkable soar, and the Russian National Bank has been able to very cleverly dodge the financial embargo. Nevertheless, even in the medium term, the war and the Western sanctions shows the long-term problems of the Russian economy, its basic commodity heaviness, the outflow of manpower and of know-how to the West and decline in population. A main victim of war will also be the Russian world. This great culture, science, literature, and music, and it will take perhaps 2 generations to reduce the hatred of the war between the two brother nations. The war is already reviving Russophobia and dividing the two brother nations into good and evil. However, it is essential for the West to take into account the great suffering of the Russian population, the huge area of its territory with mineral resources that make the country almost self-sufficient, and the large sales market in India, China, on the African continent, or in Latin America that have yet to be awakened. Therefore, Russian gas and oil, for example, will find other routes in the coming years, especially to Karner. I was in 2005 in December in the bureau of Putin, and we talk about this gas export to Russia, to China, and so forth, and the prices in China. But in 2005, the same questions as now, they were on the table. And this was very interesting to hear from Putin himself that, okay, we will get not so much money as from the Europeans, but you have to see that there are so many people, there are more than 1 milliard people, and so forth. Okay. Therefore, Russian gas and oil, for example, will find other routes, I said, especially to China and India, while Europe will have to obtain much more expensive energy from the United States, Norway, and the Arab region. With all the security risks, I want to show only and say only the Suez Canal. The energy crisis of the next few years will severely shake the social and society fabric in the West. However, Russia and the world must also prepare for a completely different scenario, which is also within the realm of real possibilities and which could have been averted 30 years ago, the so-called second Raspat, the so-called disintegration of Russia. This is a new meaning what can be happened. Already in 1955, Bertrand Russell, in view of the danger of a new nuclear war at that time in the 50s, in close exchange with Albert Einstein, asked the rulers of the world the deadly serious question: do we want to abolish mankind or war? Einstein put his very last signature under this sentence: I do not hope that the world today is again faced with this crucial question: do we want to abolish mankind or war? Therefore, a special responsibility also rests on the United States and the West to create the pressure which makes a diplomatic solution imperative.
Thank you.
This is my meaning about these problems in a very overview. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Stefan. This is on the whole a very sobering assessment. You met Putin in 2005, you said.
Yeah.
What did you make of him?
I met Putin many times, not many times, but sometimes. Putin before is in my view, before 2005 years, Putin was completely another man as I see him now on the television.
Why?
At that time, we can speak with Putin absolutely normally. All the problems in Europe, in the world, we speak about, we have spoken about it, absolutely normal. And he saw these problems. He saw the Russians' problems. He saw the world problems. He saw the problems with the refugees, with oil, with the African continent. He saw the problems also in the so-called Umwelt, and climate and so forth. But after that, and this is known everywhere, after that, he hopes that the West come him a little bit entgegen, a little bit
to make a compromise.
Yeah, a little bit in compromise in WTO, in WTO, for instance, at that time. Then in a corridor from Lisbon to Vladivostok. This was a very great project from him, but we said in that time, no, it's not possible, it's no possibility, and so forth. So we closed some doors, not all the doors, and I know that Putin also has signed some conditions, good conditions for Ukraine, and he break it down, and this is clear. But I feel that in that time we had a possibility to bring him inside a normal discussion, inside
what kind of years, what are the years when that opportunity may have been there? Which years are you referring to? What time?
Before 205.
2005.
Excuse me, 2005. Yeah, before.
Okay. Before we move on, quick question. The discontent and the protests in Russia today, and also the criticism of even Putin loyalists of what is happening in Ukraine from the Russian point of view, has that a deeper meaning, or will that blow away after a few weeks?
My friends in Russia are against this war, especially the young people, especially the educated people. But most of them are now in Georgia or everywhere. Yeah, in Russia, all is silent. Nobody is speaking. All is silent. And when Russia is so silent as now, then I feel from the history that it could be a
turning point.
Yeah, a turning point. Because now the people are feeling all that what they had in the last 20 years is now break, is now finished, and Russia cannot bring them the same as the West brought.
Thank you. And what about the Palace Coup against Putin? That some of his loyalists, the military, are rising up against him. Is that likely, or is that just what we hope when the Western media reports about it?
It is very, very. Yeah, I cannot answer to this question. It is no.
I understand. I thought I'd just ask you anyway. You may have some secret information which we would like to have. Thank you, Stefan. Let me turn to.
Thank you so much, Klaus.
No, please stay with us. Don't run away. We will ask you some more questions in a minute or so.
Thank you.
Let me turn to Mark Kramer. Mark Kramer is a professor at Harvard University and also very much a Russian and Eastern European expert. Let me ask you a very similar question. Or let's say, first of all, what is going on in Russia? And secondly, is there a division in the American public between those like the elite, the think tanks, universities like Harvard, and the intellectuals and the Washington, D.C. crowd who are actually very strongly in support of Ukraine, and the wider American public who perhaps don't really care that much? How do you see that? Will American support for Ukraine be sustainable?
It's good. It's a good question, Klaus. There is a minority of the Republican Party in the United States that has questioned assistance to Ukraine. It's reflected on television, on Fox News, with the commentator Tucker Carlson, who is a right-wing populist commentator, very ardently pro-Donald Trump, who has repeatedly denounced Ukraine and basically taken such a strongly pro-Putin position that there are even allegations that Carlson may be working on behalf of the Kremlin, maybe not as a paid agent, but at least indirectly on behalf of the Kremlin. Again, that's probably mostly empty speculation, but he is an influential commentator with the sort of the pro-Trump portion of the U.S. electorate. But I wouldn't say, though, that it is there's a really strong divide over this issue in the United States. For the most part, there's been strong public support for aiding Ukraine. Trump himself, I should add, he's been all over the place on the issue, but generally he has been supportive of assisting Ukraine, even though he initially his initial position was quite different. And he has a very strange relationship with Ukraine, going back to the time of his phone call with President Zelensky in 2019. But leaving all that aside, there are midterm congressional elections coming up in the United States on the 8th of November, and this is not a salient issue. And the elections are being driven by questions of the economy, of gasoline prices, of inflation more generally, and so it's not a salient issue, and it's not an issue that candidates in the congressional election are really bringing up. It ranks way down on the list. So the Biden administration, for the most part, has had a fairly easy time getting approval for its requests for assistance to Ukraine, and there has been a great deal of military assistance from the United States. The largest provision of military assistance in the post-Cold War era, and it's, even by the standards of the Cold War, is quite substantial. So it is surprising that there hasn't been much controversy about it. But part of that is simply that the flagrant nature of Russia's aggression against Ukraine is so obvious that it has overwhelmed or tended to dampen any attempt to question the aid, because it's about as unadorned a defensive war that Ukraine is waging. That is an effort to stave off Russia's attempt to destroy Ukraine as a viable country. And that was reflected, I should add, in the most recent attacks, the attacks over the last few days, when Putin lashed out and undertook a long series of missile attacks against Ukrainian cities. Not a single military target was struck by those attacks. They were all directed against civilian targets and the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. And it made obvious that this is not the illegitimacy of Russia's war and the aggressive nature of it. So again, to the extent that there would have been any push to raise this issue in the congressional elections in the United States, that those attacks, I think, basically put an end to it. So the only concern that is still present really is the question of nuclear weapons, but that is probably a separate issue that we'll come back to in this discussion. Let me add, with respect to Russia, 20 years ago, there was a great deal of support in Ukraine for very friendly and close relations with Russia. That from basically the late 1990s through the early 2000s, there was overwhelming support in Ukraine. Looking back, it may seem surprising, but that there was much stronger push to have close relations with Russia than with Western countries. And there was little support for membership in NATO. It was never higher than 20%. It was generally down between 10 and 20%. And that remained the case until 2014. What changed the sentiment in Ukraine toward Russia was Russia's actions. That is, Putin's occupation and annexation of Crimea, his instigation of a war in eastern Ukraine, the use of Russian troops to foment warfare in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass, and other actions that the Russian government took starting in 2014 that signaled a malevolent view of Ukraine and malevolent policies. And so to the extent that there is opposition in Ukraine now to Russia and the kind of hostility toward Russia, it's entirely a result of Russia's actions. It's not because there is inherently some Russophobia, as the word was brought up. It isn't that. It's the opposite, that there had been a desire for a friendly relationship with Russia, and the Russian government under Putin spurned it. I fully agree with Stefan, by the way, that Putin is different now from the way he was earlier, even though I think as a product of the KGB and as a figure who took Russia back quite aggressively to an authoritarian system, I never had any particular positive feelings about him. But he was president from when he was first elected in March 2000. He had been acting president before that, but until he stepped down and became prime minister in 2008. But when he returned as president in 2012, he seems to have pursued a much different path, both internally and in his foreign policy since then. It seems to have really wanted to return to a much tighter and more repressive system internally, adopted a lot of laws that basically barred any attempts at dissent and made it very difficult for people who wanted to push for democracy to engage in any sort of activity, and also tightened the Russian foreign policy and took it in a much more hardline direction. And again, that was reflected in 2014 toward Ukraine and everything that has continued to this day vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Thanks, Mark. What is going on in Russia today? Do you have any inkling, any information? Is that discontent we hear about, we read about, is that to be taken seriously if you were Putin? And what about that criticism from inside his loyalist circle? How can that be explained? Is it to be taken seriously?
Well, the criticism inside his circle is mostly about fighting more aggressively and wanting to step up the warfare to the extent there is any. Again, Putin runs a very tight ship, and some of the coverage of questions about the war get a little bit exaggerated because he is the definitely the commander-in-chief who is overseeing the war effort. But to the extent there is questioning within his circle, it's mostly about that Russia should pursue a harsher line toward Ukraine. There is no evidence of anyone who is questioning whether the war should continue. Quite the opposite. Within Russian society, there is a minority. It's very difficult to estimate because polling is so difficult. There are polls that have been conducted, and the Levada Center, for example, has made valiant efforts to try to gauge people's sentiments, but it's inherently a difficult thing. There's probably, say, a 15 to 20% segment of Russian society who are opposed to the war in principle, a somewhat larger slice who oppose it because young people are being sent to war, and basically there have been tens of thousands killed already, and others who have questioned the mobilization, further mobilization of troops. But again, you're talking about a minority of Russian society, and repressive laws and other measures have been adopted, making it extremely difficult to engage in protest. There have been thousands of Russians who have been arrested. There is a group in Russia that keeps track of the arrests. It's up between 15 and 20,000 people who've been arrested, but it is almost impossible to organize any sort of meaningful rally against the war. And that, in other words, this isn't going to become a situation like the United States in the late 1960s, early 1970s. It simply is impossible in Russia to engage in organized protest on any meaningful scale. So in that respect, Putin domestically enjoys a relatively free hand. I would add, just you raised the question earlier about a Palace Coup. Again, that strikes me as mostly wishful thinking. even if there were a Palace Coup, it's not clear that whoever would replace Putin would be better, probably worse. But in any event, I see no real threat to Putin's position currently. If the war were to go very badly, which it already has for Russia, but if it were to go much worse, then I could see potentially there would be some sort of threat to his position, but not currently.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Jörg again, and I will ask a few more questions to our discussants, and then we open it up to Q&A from the audience. Jörg, do you see the coherence of the transatlantic alliance endangered if the war is going to continue, is becoming even worse regarding civilian casualties, regarding the economic costs of the war? Or do you think that new harmony in transatlantic relations, which we have seen since February, will eventually split up? You're muted, Jörg.
Sorry for that. To answer your question, let me pick up a point that Mark has made and that reminded me of the impact it has also in Germany, and that is the role of the media and the importance of images for a sustainable support of the war or a decline of this support. And it is true that when we saw the pictures of an indiscriminate warfare, of rockets hitting civilian targets, in addition to what we've seen in Bucha with the war crimes, I think that has had a very strong impact on the public perception and this and a certain support of this Zeitenwende. We will not go back behind this, I think, because at that moment, the attack of civilian targets and war crimes were no longer just a theoretical option. It was there. It was real, and we all could see it. And just the latest discussion on the buildup of a European air defense system, I think, is a result of this visual effect that the pictures had on public awareness. So I think that the protests go into a wrong direction, as I tried to point out in my initial remarks, because they are turning the interest away from the war towards the government. But on the whole, I'm optimistic that the Zeitenwende will lead to something more lasting. I mean, the term Zeitenwende is just a metaphor that is more or less reflecting what is going on. Maybe it's a clarion call, but it's not a strategy. And it is important now, I think, to come up with a more encompassing view and a strategy to reform or think in new ways in various fields, and it is important to do this in the framework of the European Union and the transatlantic partnership.
Thanks, Jörg. But when we heard this morning, I think it was, or yesterday, it was Olaf Scholz's foreign policy advisor saying that Germany was a teenager in terms of international affairs and security affairs. This is a little ridiculous, isn't it? Coming from the Europe's largest country, richest country, strongest country. Shouldn't that country step up, as I asked you before, much more quickly than rather growing gradually from a teenager into a mature adult?
Well, I don't know exactly what he was referring to, and I can only speak on my behalf, of course. But as a military historian, I think of the phase or the era of security policies that has ended right now. If we consider the whole period after 1945 to the present, I think we can distinguish three different phases. And the first one is with the German armed forces focusing on the defense of the country and the alliance. And then after the end of the Cold War, we have had 30 years of a time where the out-of-area missions were much more important. And the infrastructure of the armed forces, the personnel and the technical resources were redirected towards this very different goal of being able to do these out-of-area missions. And that had consequences for the equipment, as I said, the technical equipment, all this that is missing right now. And maybe he was referring to this when he said, we have been a teenager, but of course, you're right in terms of the production of military weapons. We are strong, and I think what is going on right now with the delivery of the air defense system, I think the first of 4 highly technical systems have been delivered, is hopefully a good sign of growing up, so to speak.
Thanks very much. Let me turn to Nadia again. Nadia, do you think that Bulgaria and Hungary are the 2 outliers in Eastern Europe, which may not line up with the other members of the European Union, particularly those in Eastern Europe, who are, of course, strongly anti-Russian because they are so close to the Russian giant? Or do we see other splittings in the coherent front towards Russia, which we see at the moment?
Nadia, unmute yourself.
Did you hear me, Nadia?
Oh, yeah, I did. So, but if I got the question right, your question was referring to Hungary and Bulgaria,
yes,
who behave kind of in a different way than
yes,
other EU member states.
Yeah.
Was that the question? And also different from many other NATO countries. Well, again, I started with the historical roots of Bulgaria, of Russian-Bulgarian relations, and we cannot avoid and forget this trend of our society. Also, there are many other practical approaches to the Bulgarian, let's say, stand on the political on political scene at the moment. As I said, the attitude to the Russian-Ukrainian war is maybe one of the main issues within Bulgarian political circles, and it has been, deep division. How should we react? I think I mentioned that we didn't provide any weaponry, and I don't think that the new parliament will take a decision to provide any weaponry, but because as President Radev, for example, states, that will mean a war between NATO and Russia, and Bulgaria is not a country that should take part in any war. So we do what we can do, maybe, and as we did until now, this is to provide only military technical assistance, but not weaponry. It is just impossible. That means, according to the President Radev and some of political parties, that Bulgaria will be. They fear that Bulgaria will be in some ways like take any side, or this is just a question of national security. Of course, because Bulgaria supported all the sanctions, as I mentioned, we have suffered a lot, and we will suffer a lot in terms of economic consequences for the country and for the whole society. Because Bulgaria, and I wanted to turn to this, we highly depend on Russian energy supplies, maybe more than, I don't know in percentage, but I'm sure almost maybe not 100%, over 90%. So this is all these historical roots of relations, long-term political times, the national, the attitude of as you mentioned, vast majority of Bulgarian population towards Russia. There are many other factors that contributes to this attitude. Of course, everybody says in Bulgaria that we blame the war. Bulgaria was one of the countries that accepted immediately because we were very close to the war. Even if you go just by of course, those waves of refugees couldn't use any other transportation rather than just cars and buses. Bulgarian government immediately sent buses, provided buses and any other supplies of food or whatever was needed for Ukraine refugees. So Bulgaria, this is another. We have to, of course, everybody knows, but in Europe especially, that the attitude to Ukrainian refugees is so much different than the attitude of not only Bulgarian population, but I think any European country population to any other refugee waves that Europe experienced, during the 21st century. So Bulgarians as people, we accept Ukrainian refugees and, to our land, to our homes, to our hotels, providing everything that is necessary, including now, even in the universities, in the institutes. There are people who are very well and warmly accepted and welcomed to have positions, and Bulgarian government opened job positions for those.
Could I add, Klaus, just one thing on this? Just to reinforce what Nadia has said. I would actually draw a stronger contrast with Hungary, because Hungary has, except yesterday, I should add, Hungary voted in favor of the UN General Assembly resolution denouncing Russia. Every NATO country did. And that was in contrast to Hungary's earlier stances when it was abstaining on votes. So every NATO country now voted in favor of that resolution. And I should add that a country that I would contrast, to give an indication of Bulgaria's stance. Bulgaria, except on the provision of weaponry, which Bulgaria doesn't have large supplies to provide, although there was a proposal for it to provide some old MiG fighters, but that got derailed for the reasons that Nadia mentioned. But but contrast that with Serbia. Say, now Serbia has voted against Russia on every resolution, but it has also not complied with the sanctions against Russia. And so in May, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, signed a new agreement with Putin on provision of natural gas. And Serbia in general has helped to circumvent to get around the sanctions imposed against Russia. Even though, again, Serbia has voted consistently to condemn Russia for the invasion, and nonetheless has evaded the sanctions. So it's a contrast to neighboring Bulgaria. Now, admittedly, Serbia is not a member of NATO or the EU. And so it's a different case, but because Bulgaria is obviously a member of both, but still, it does show that that it is surprising that Bulgaria has gone along as much as it has, because of all of the factors that Nadia mentioned, the sort of traditional close relationship with Russia, the heavy dependence on Russia for energy resources until now. That's changing now.
That's a bit of putting a positive spin on Bulgaria's role. Let me turn to Stefan, and then we will turn to our audience. May I remind our audience that you please can submit your questions in writing by using the chat function on your Zoom screen, and I will turn to these questions in a minute. First, I would like to ask Stefan, whether the new threat or renewed threat of nuclear war, whether that will actually hasten all countries to find a solution to the war, to somehow bring the war to an end. What is your assessment?
If I understand you right, then I mean either Putin or Russia became a loser of the war, then in that case, I mean, it would be very dangerous because Putin stands to the wall and he has, from his feeling, no chance and no opportunity to go out and say, okay, it was a joke or whatever. So in that case, it will be very dangerous for the whole world. I feel it. And on the other hand side, if Ukraine goes, and Putin also, to a compromise, for instance, Crimea to Russia, and then the question what it should be with the eastern countries of Donbass, and then a compromise could be in that way. But for all that is necessary, that Washington and Moscow, including Kiev and the NATO, are on a table to discuss all this. And now, at that moment, I cannot see a basic for a situation for a compromise now, because both sides are in favor to win this war, and this is the problem now. We have on both sides no leaders who can understand that we are looking in a hell, the whole world.
Sure. Should we really encourage the US and Russia to talk to each other, as
Yes.
Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, suggested? He also suggested that Donald Trump should actually the American mediator.
No,
that of course is highly unrealistic. But should the US and Russia talk rather than the Ukrainians and Russia?
Yeah, both, three. Russia, US, and the Ukrainian, and of course the other countries too, in the NATO countries, of course, but on the first table are the US and Russia and the Ukrainian, and maybe it could be a way to this compromise, to this table, that maybe that the help for Ukraine or should be very strong, or a little bit lower.
Yeah, isn't the question again about appeasement and a hard line position?
Yeah, of
should
course.
we enter into a compromise? Should we be unrelentingly hard line?
I personally, and I'm for a compromise. I personally see I am in favor of a compromise, because all the other alternatives should will be, or would be, a very complicated situation and a very dangerous time for the whole world. I
Mark,
see.
thank you. Mark, what do you think about
Yeah,
that?
I mean, the problem in talking about compromises or settlements is the Russian government has shown over the last 8 years that it attaches no value to the commitments it adopts. That is, it has violated every treaty that it has signed with Ukraine, going back to 1991, and particularly continuing through such treaties as the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation in 1997, and about 20 other agreements and treaties that it signed with Ukraine. It has violated every one of them. So what credibility could be attached to any sort of compromise the Russian government would sign? It would simply be a prelude to the next attack that either Putin or someone else in Russia would launch. So I unfortunately think this war is going to have to be sorted out on the battlefield. And that's where Ukraine has overwhelming public support. It's about 95% support for continuing the war and for not compromising. That is, for seeking to regain the territories that Russia seized from it and sought to annex. And again, it's easy to talk about compromises, but there's no sentiment on behalf of it. And I think quite credible, for quite good reason, that Ukrainians have lost any belief that Russia will stick by an agreement it will sign.
Thank you. Quick reply, Stefan.
Peace could only be if Ukraine is very strong, if Ukraine is militarized, if we give Ukraine all the possibilities to be a military strong state, and then you can talk, and then you can see a compromise that the Crimea is going to Russia or will be a part of Russia, and what is going on the Donbass, it is on the table and it must be discussed.
Right, thank you very much. I will ask Jörg and Nadia the same question in a minute, but first of all, I think I would like to turn to Willow to ask our questions from the audience. Willow, would you like to ask the first question?
Thank you so much to our panelists for talking with us today. We have a question from Miriam Popkadze from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. The West has shown unprecedented unity over Ukraine. How sustainable is this unity? And can this war in Ukraine help the West and the US and the EU forge a unity of on China in this newly reemerged struggle between democracy and autocracy?
Jörg or Nadia, who would like to answer this question? Who goes first? Jörg, you want to try? But can I ask our presenters to all unmute themselves? Don't mute yourself so you can jump in spontaneously.
You're gonna have to unmute yourself.
All right. Yeah. No. Well, I am optimistic, or I remain optimistic, that the West, or that this unity that we're witnessing right now, will be sustainable. And I mean, who would have thought just a couple of months ago in what kind of a situation of unity we are? I mean, it was one of Putin's miscalculation to assume that NATO will not be united, that the Europeans will be preoccupied with their internal problems about more or less democratic states like Hungary and so on, and Turkey. And here we are in a different situation. It's not complete homogeneity, but I think there is a broad consensus on the value of defending the core values of what the transatlantic alliance and the European community is built on: freedom and democracy. And I think this is what it is about, and this is what will keep the countries together.
Despite the economic pain.
despite the economic pain that the governments, the national governments, and maybe the European community will manage to deal with somehow.
Okay,
I mean, this is what I'm witnessing in Germany. Yeah.
Thank you. Nadia, what do you think? Will the Atlantic Alliance stick together despite the economic pain?
Yes, I think that the NATO countries and European Union countries will stick together. I think that we will experience a very long and very bad winter that is coming in 2022, 2023. But nevertheless, I think that Bulgaria and also other countries, EU countries and NATO countries will stick together no matter how much we will, suffer and sacrifice.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to Nadia for the next question.
Hello, I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. This was very insightful, but I myself have a question, especially since we have a Balkan expert here. We have been talking this entire time about the threats from this war in Ukraine to Europe in general. And I was wondering if these threats mirror those that happened in the Balkan Wars, and following that, Russia's position during the Kosovo War. I was wondering if that could have foreshadowed the invasion or just like in general, the tensions in Ukraine.
And I should add that Nadia, of course, has a Bosnian background. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could I jump in on that, even though I'll obviously defer to Nadia on it? But when you referred to Balkan Wars, I assume you mean the Yugoslav Wars of Separation, not the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just want to be clear. So there's no question that Kosovo plays a big role nowadays. It drives Serbia's policy, for example. Serbia has, as I mentioned, which is not a member of the EU and not a member of NATO, and was at war with NATO in 1999, but has voted consistently against Russia in UN General Assembly resolutions, and has openly condemned the occupation of Crimea as well as of other territories Russia has seized. But it has seen the current war, the Russia-Ukraine war, through the prism of what happened in Kosovo in 1999. And if you look at Vucic's speech, President Vucic's speech at the UN General Assembly last month, it's very much cast in those terms. And similarly for Russia, the impact of the war over Kosovo had a much greater impact on Russian foreign policy than anything to do with NATO enlargement. NATO enlargement is mostly, not entirely, but mostly a red herring. By contrast, when NATO went to war in 1999 over Russia's objections, it had a very far-reaching impact in Russia. Putin wasn't president at the time, but the Russian government took a very strong stance against it, and it had a very negative impact on Russian public opinion as well. So nowadays, when Putin refers to that war, it's not entirely propaganda. It is a war that shaped Russian opinion of Russia's role in the world and NATO's role in the world.
Thank you, Mark. And you were referring to the 1999 war in Kosovo, right?
Over Kosovo primarily, not to the earlier wars. Especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there was much more agreement between NATO countries and Russia over it, about especially in 1995. But 1999 was entirely different.
Thank you very much.
They were on opposite sides.
Nadia, do you want to come in as well?
Well, it's hard for a few minutes to wrap up American foreign policy and the U.S. involvement, political or military, in wars, or the attention that United States the public opinion pays to what is going on. I wouldn't make any comparisons between the Russian military operation or invasion or war, Russian-Ukrainian war, as it's called now, and what happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the role of the United States at that time, bringing together the warring parties and taking efforts, both military efforts and also diplomatic efforts, to bring to the table of negotiations the warring parties. At that time, the nature of the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina was completely different than the nature of the conflict now. So we cannot put, from theoretical point of view, even we cannot put we can have comparison, but it won't be even comparison. So I wouldn't compare those conflicts. I mean, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is ethnic and religious and conflict, and the war between the two countries here, which are two separate two states. So it's hard to make any comparison. I didn't get the point. Are you referring only to American foreign policy towards the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to make some comparison to the American policy now to the war?
Well, let's leave.
It's a long topic. It's a long topic. In any event, one thing is obvious, that the United States were the only superpower after the break of the Berlin Wall, and within the changing architecture of the European security, it still keeps the position of a unique superpower. But there are different motives and different, to the policy, to the Balkan War, and now to the policy of the American government to the war in Russian.
Thank you very much.
Because may I jump in as well?
Sure, but briefly, please.
Just a quick comment, because I think that Leila raises a very fascinating question in a more general sense as well. And that is one of the impacts, from a historian point of view at least, one of the impacts of this war, I think, is that it will most likely change our vision of the past, or the way we look at the past of the Cold War years after 1945, and maybe put the emphasis more on continuities rather than discontinuities. That remains to be seen, but for me as a historian, I think this is an important impact that relates to my work.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I think you're perfectly right. We will reevaluate our recent past once again, and it's also totally necessary. You're quite right. I have an interesting question here from Elfie Rembel from Berlin, and she asked whether the Americans are actually suffering as much as the Europeans. Are not the Europeans the ones who really suffer, who have the particularly high energy prices and all the economic problems, while the United States may actually benefit from the war by, for example, selling their LNG gas at higher prices than they normally would do, by making a killing perhaps even with their sale of military goods. Is that correct? Is there something in that, or is that an overinterpretation? Stefan, what do you think?
I mean, it is more or less correct for my meaning. Yes.
Any reason
I mean,
why?
I would say the extent of economic upheaval is definitely greater in Europe than in the United States, but it certainly and most of the economic impact in the United States preceded the war, because it was connected with the repercussions from the pandemic and all of the supply line disruptions and other consequences of the global shutdowns during the war. But whether the United States will emerge stronger, I think is probably a bit going too far, in the sense that it is true the United States is a very large energy producer, but the Biden administration was extremely angry that Saudi Arabia agreed with other OPEC countries and with Russia to limit the supply of oil, to cut back on supplies of oil. So it's having an impact in the United States too.
Thank you. So Jörg, would you agree with the question? Do the Europeans suffer much more than the United States is?
Well, we will see what will come out of this, but well, I'm tempted to say that I just had a chance to get an impression of everyday life in an American city, in Houston, to be precise, and it struck me to see the differences in terms of the measures that have been taken. Here in Germany, or in my hometown in Potsdam, in the Berlin area, it's part of our everyday life that we are asked to reduce our energy in our households, that we verify certain energy consuming instruments, that temperatures in my office, for instance, have to be lowered, that lights should be turned out once you leave your room, and so on. These are very precise measures that are supposed to be taken. None of this have I experienced a couple of weeks ago in the US. So it's my very spontaneous impression, since you asked me, is that right now there is a difference, at least in the perception and the measures taken to prevent the outcome.
Thank you very much. Bilo, can we have the next question?
Certainly. We have a question from Ross Delston, and this is actually a question that I also have, and so I'm going to be supplementing the question as well. But Biden recently put out a fairly worrying statement that, quote, nuclear Armageddon is currently at its highest risk since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Putin has also threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Is this the same kind of threat that's been used in the past, which is that of a primarily deterrent strategy? And given that tactical nukes are primarily used for short-range targets, if Putin does use those nuclear arms, would the US or NATO or the EU implement a full-scale nuclear response?
Thank you. Mark, do you want to tackle
Okay.
that?
60 years ago this month that the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. There is an enormous amount of evidence of what happened during that crisis that has become available over the past 60 years, particularly the last 30 to 35 years. And what it shows is that the primary area of concern was the unauthorized actions or the accidents that could occur and perhaps bring on nuclear war. What the documents also show, though, is that once a crisis came to a head and leaders realized that there was a risk of nuclear war, they did everything they could to try to avoid it. And it was one thing to speculate about it or to face up to the hypothetical scenario beforehand, as Khrushchev did. He initially, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader during the crisis, who before, in September of 1962, he had given authorization for local commanders in Cuba to be able to use tactical nuclear weapons against a possible US invasion of Cuba. But when the crisis began in October, that authority was taken away. And in fact, the Soviet Ministry of Defense made clear that any prospective use of nuclear weapons had to be authorized from Moscow. So it was a very significant reversal in tightening nuclear command authority. It showed the sobering effect that the prospect of nuclear warfare could have on commanders. So right now it is purely a hypothetical prospect in in looking at the current war, because there is a great deal that Russia can do without resorting to nuclear weapons. And it is very unclear what the use of nuclear weapons would actually gain. It wouldn't really, there aren't really major targets in Ukraine on which it would have any significant effect that would help the war effort. There are many that would be disastrous politically and would kill very large numbers of people, but it wouldn't really help Russia's war effort. If anything, it would be a disaster. So I would caution against assuming that nuclear war is close, or that the prospect of the use of tactical nuclear weapons is really there. I tend to be much more skeptical about that some of this has been overstated. But it is good that leaders of NATO countries are taking the prospect seriously, and they should be thinking about what they would do if Putin were to make the disastrous mistake of using nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Mark. Stefan, you know Putin well. Would he be prepared to use nuclear weapons?
It could be.
Why do you think so?
Because if he comes in a position, then he stands behind on a wall, and no other solution could be. Then it could be a tactical nuclear bomb, or in this.
But what would he gain from doing so? Because we know NATO, the United States, would react in a terrible way, probably non-nuclear.
No. I mean, in that moment, you cannot rationally see what the Russian leadership is doing then, and it could be a nuclear, not a strategic, but a determined nuclear war. Yes, it could be. We have to see it.
Thank you. Well,
unfortunately, but
everyone's slightly more optimistic?
Klaus, but I hope that the coming winter will decide many in this war, in the West and in Russia too. The coming winter. Look, I'm here in my room, and the temperature is 19 degrees. 19. The same situation as in Potsdam. Yeah, we are all under the new rules, and if our possibility to heat in wintertime in Italy, in France, in Germany, in Austria, in Slovakia, and so forth, is not possible to heat and all the other, then it could be a very explosion situation, a social situation, a very the people then the people would not be in favor to protect or to agree with the sanctions. Mm-hmm. And it could be very dangerous also that our society will not in favor to continue this protection.
Thank you, Stefan. I have to say, and I agree with Jörg, it's definitely warmer in Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
I haven't even turned on my radiator yet.
Leila, can we have the next question?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
So,
I'm going. Klaus.
Yeah.
I have
absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. All the best to all of us, all of you.
Stefan, we will finish in a few minutes anyway, but thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure, and I hope
thank you so much, and all the best for all of you.
Thank you very much to you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Leila, would you ask our next question?
Yes. So Khalif is wondering, since we've talked about like the economic effects of this war in Europe, he was wondering what are the political effects of this war in Europe, and more so if the rise of like far right gains in Sweden, France, and now even Italy, if the war in Ukraine has any contributing factors to like EU geopolitics.
Who would like to tackle that question?
Jörg raised it earlier, so maybe Jörg, if you...
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the points, one of my initial points when it comes to the impact of the war in Germany. We have an upswing of the right-wing populist party, which reached, I think, or would reach right now 25%, but it's still a minority. Chances are that with an increase of the energy crisis, things could get worse. But again, there is a huge majority that does not support this political shift. And there is a government working on alleviating some of the consequences, among other things, certainly to avoid a political development in this direction.
Thank you. Willow, we will please ask the next question. Perhaps we have another 2 or 3 questions, and then we will bring it to an end, because we are coming close to the 2-hour limit, really. And we don't want to overextend our discussants or our audience, indeed. Willow, would you like to ask another question?
Yes, we have a question from Elfie at Nadia Boyadjieva. Would the Bulgarian government and probably a majority of Bulgarian people accept a border change as a possible outcome of this war?
You are muted, Nadia.
Border change, you mean in Ukraine?
Yeah.
I believe that is what.
Well, I believe that this is the question, because otherwise changing borders,
Greater Bulgaria.
Yeah, well, Bulgaria is relatively close to the military conflict, but I don't think that at this very right moment Bulgarian society thinks of this option to changing borders. So that there are a lot, of course, as I think Stefan raised the question about not about changing, yes, about, for example, negotiations and possible results of these negotiations, what will happen with those areas that are now under Russian, occupied by Russian military. I wouldn't favor myself, if you ask me myself, I wouldn't favor changing borders at all, because it will bring not only troubles in Ukraine and in the relations, further troubles in the relations between Russia and Ukraine, but also it will can have, effect on neighboring countries, and also to European countries, some European countries where the government is not so strong, because it will be like a domino effect. So I don't think that anybody now wants to change borders in Bulgaria. And I also, there is, because also in Bulgaria, because also of historical reasons, and Bulgaria is how to put it, we have a lot of, we don't call minorities, but minority groups in Bulgaria. And from national security point of view, I don't think that any political party or any political circle or any group in the society would be in favor of changing borders in another country, because we want to keep what we have in our country, on our borders and our nation together.
Thanks very much. I just see a question for Jörg here. The question is by Ben Hughes: what or which NATO countries or EU countries have delivered most of the most military aid to Ukraine, apart obviously from the United States?
Well, I think if we refer the answer to the number of or the population, I think it's the Baltic states. That would be my guess, to put it that way.
Okay, the Baltic states, but also, of course, the UK and also Germany
Poland.
actually delivered
Poland
quite a bit.
Turkey too, yeah. Even though a NATO country, not EU, but the United States has provided, certainly the largest. But the UK, as you said, Klaus, has. Poland has provided a great deal. The Baltic states, proportionally, as you mentioned, have provided a great deal. Surprisingly, even countries like Italy have provided some. The question arose a short while ago about the war is having a domestic impact in Italy, not a very healthy one, but so the Italian government, at least until the current one that is just formed, had provided assistance to Ukraine. So there's been pretty broad and sustained support for Ukraine. Whether it will survive the winter remains to be seen, but it's been surprisingly broad.
Thank you very much indeed. Perhaps we have one more question, and that question is actually a good concluding question about Putin and how we assess the situation. Willow, would you like to ask that question?
Sure. It's a simple question. Is it possible for Putin to save face and get out of the war, or is it too late for him?
Oh, sure, it's possible. Putin is able to shape perceptions in Russia to a much greater extent than is often realized. He could pull Russian forces out tomorrow, declare victory, and he would have broad support for it in Russia. There would be complaints, but those would pale by comparison to the support that he would be able to generate in Russian society. So it's not a question of whether he could save face. It's more a question of whether he has any intention of doing that. And unfortunately, I just don't see it. I think he has really committed himself to a war that is having disastrous consequences for all of Europe, and isn't interested in face-saving exits from it.
Thank you very much. Before we finish this session for today and our very interesting discussion, I would like to ask each of our discussants to perhaps briefly assess and also speculate a little how this war will end, and whether we will next year, this time in October of next year, whether we will still talk about an ongoing war, or whether the war will have really come to a conclusion by then, and of course how. Jörg, would you like to begin?
So you're seriously asking a historian to speculate about the future.
Right.
No, I mean, as the saying goes, historians are prophets only with regard to the past and not to the future. So all I can do is hope that we will come to a quick end due to lack of resources, or maybe something, or maybe Ukraine can take advantage of the momentum that it has right now. But everything else would be pure speculation. So let's hope.
Are you optimistic or not?
I remain optimist, as I try to point out in my interventions here, and let's hope that the transatlantic alliance and the European community will stick together, because with respect to the nuclear questions that we just addressed, I think the only thing that will work is deterrence, and we're not supposed to deter ourselves, but to make it quite clear what the consequences would be if there is no rational behavior anymore. And I think, Klaus, as you said, a reaction by the West must not necessarily be nuclear as well. It can be a conventional strike, but I think this is, after all that we have seen in the Russians' behavior, the only way to behave, because there is no way not to behave, and this is the way I think we should behave.
Thank you very much. Nadia, when and how will the war end?
Again, you're asking the wrong person, Klaus. I'm historian as well, and also I'm not a critical scientist. So you ended up with historian and a lawyer, so I cannot say when, but I hope, and I remain optimist. I hope that even before the winter, the real winter starts, because believe me, the winter in Russia and in Ukraine, I've been during the winter in both countries, is very, very bad. So I hope that there will be some kind of initiative for diplomatic talks and like preliminary talks, at least before the real winter starts. But if not before the winter, maybe, again, I'm speculating, of course, after the winter, after everybody is exhausted, after we all suffer, especially in Europe, especially in Balkan countries, both parties, both warring, parties get exhausted, and they will be more inclined to go to the table of negotiations. And this is the only solution for this, to end the conflict. There is no other solution.
Thank you. And the last word to you, Mark, or the last speculation, if I may say.
I mean, I guess I'm more pessimistic in that, for the reasons I alluded to before, is there was an article published by a former colleague of mine who unfortunately died last year, Robert Powell, called "War is a Commitment Problem." And that is the case here, that Russia has shown it.
Sorry, war is a commitment?
War as a commitment problem. And the basic argument, it's a clever mathematical model, but he argues that states have problems credibly giving the credible assurance that they'll live up to the commitments they adopt. And that is the case here. The Russian government has shown itself in its behavior toward Ukraine over the last 8 years, has shown itself so willing to violate every commitment it has adopted, including about the 2 Minsk protocols that were adopted, that it's hard for me to see a negotiated solution really being viable here. I think this war is going to have to be, the outcome is going to have to depend on what happens on the battlefield, and that's going to take quite a while, unless Putin somehow tires of it, pulls Russian troops out and declares victory. And I think everyone can hope that that will happen. I'm just not very confident it will.
Unfortunately, Mark, I would largely agree with your point of view here and your assessment, but we will see. Perhaps Jörg's optimism is more justified than your or mine pessimism, and Nadia is also slightly more pessimistic, but perhaps we are all wrong and something miraculous will happen. We will, of course, hope for the best. And I would like to thank our discussants, Stefan Karner, who has already had to go, and Jörg Echternkamp, Nadia, and Mark Kramer, and of course our 2 Krasno assistants, Willow and Leila, who have been very helpful as always tonight. And I would like to thank all of our audience, of course. Many of our audience have actually stayed with us again to the bitter end. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Klaus.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Good to see you, Jörg.
Yeah, good to see you, Mark. Thank you, Klaus.
Our next Krasno event is in November, and I will send out the information in due course. So I hope to see you, all of you, again in November. And again, thank you very much to our discussants. Thank you very much to our audience. And well, have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.